Sometimes it's called the gypsy problem. I think these words are weighted to some extent. Certainly, the problem isn't simply ours. It's the non-Romani world. It's a problem that we Roma have with non-Roma as well. And events such as this bring both sides together in a constructive way, I hope. I don't see it as a one-sided problem. It's something that has to be approached from both sides and understood. And what I want to do briefly, very briefly, is point out, identify a number of the problems that we have to be able to understand and address. First of all, Roma are certainly outsiders. Our ancestors did indeed start out in Asia and came into the West, into Europe in the early Middle Ages, and have spread out to practically everywhere since then. But in the past few years, we have been, a number of us who are Roma and who know our language and who have academic training, have been able to have a fresh look at our history and to reconstruct our identity. And it's quite clear that we have a paradox, and I believe this is the root of the problem. The paradox is that the Romani population, which is huge, has its roots in Asia. The culture, the language, the genetic roots are from Asia. But the identity, even the language that we speak, crystallized on the doorstep of the West. I don't want to go into the details of the history, but coming as a mixed population from northwestern India and staying in the Byzantine Empire for perhaps 200 years, and then taking shape through intermarriage with each other and with outsiders, Byzantine Greeks and Armenians and so on, and the language crystallizing. So the identity was taking shape here, and we can regard the Byzantine Empire as the West essentially. It was Christian, it was Greek-speaking. When the Islamic spread pushed populations up into Europe, this is when the migrations really gathered momentum. But there had been movements across into Europe over this period of time, over perhaps a 200-year period of time. And there seems to have been, on the basis of linguistic and historical evidence that we have, 3 major moves across. And the earliest one spreading out to the furthest reaches of Europe, around the north coast and down. The second one centering in Hungary and what would now be Slovakia and Czech Republic and in this area. And then the third one coming in last of all, particularly because of the encroachment of the Ottomans and being kept in slavery in what is today Romania. So as the identity, the ethnic identity was taking shape, so at the very same time that population was fragmenting and leaving the same area. This means that there has never been a single Romani people at a single time with a single sense of one identity, speaking one single kind of Romani. Our language exists in very many different dialects. It is one language, but it exists in many dialects. That's the first thing. We are an Asian people, our roots in Asia, however much Asian genetic evidence there is in our makeup now, 1,000 years later. But it's like a square peg in a round hole, and that needs to be understood before any proper understanding can be brought about. That has not been recognized for a very long time, especially during the years pre-1989 in the communist, under the communist regimes in Europe, and outside of that part of Europe too. Roma have typically been regarded as a population defined by behavior, socially defined, not ethnically. The differences were not acknowledged, not taken into account. They have to be. But this leads into the next set of problems, and that is because of the nature of our history, different groups have retained more or less of our linguistic and cultural heritage. There are some groups that don't speak the language at all. Most Hungarian Roma do not speak Romani. That was because of policies in the 1700s forbidding the use of the language. Other groups, such as those who were liberated from slavery in the middle of the 19th century, have, because of their isolation for centuries on the Romanian estates, have retained the language and the culture to a very high degree. Now, one policy taking this into consideration obviously cannot be applied across the board. Different countries have different policies about multicultural societies, recognition, acknowledgement. So country by country we have differences. Different Romani populations, we have to look at barriers created from the inside and barriers created from the outside. From the outside there have been policies. There are still one or two laws in this country, in the United States, that operate against, quotes, gypsies, written into the laws. So this is discrimination from the outside. We can look at what really should be called as discrimination originating from within, because in conservative Romani culture, outsiders, gaje, are seen as spiritually polluting. They present a threat to the culture and to spiritual purity. These are inherited cultural factors from India, but they're very strong in some cultures. They will prevent families from sending children to school in some instances. So in some places where the establishment won't let Roma into school, that's discrimination from the outside, but there are families who will keep their kids at home. Discrimination from the inside. This has to be accommodated. There are populations who certainly are of Romani descent, and I mentioned the Romungre in Hungary, but who have, because of outside pressure, lost the language and to a large extent the culture, and yet on the basis of their physical appearance, often the family name, often the district in which they live, often the job they do, they are still identified as Tsigani, even though they cannot function in a conservative Romani milieu because they don't speak the language and have lost a lot of the culture too. So they're caught in the middle, and very many of those people would welcome even assimilation. We have to make a distinction between assimilation and integration. Most Roma would like integration. Many would like assimilation. Some would like to be left alone. There's no single policy, no blanket policy that could possibly deal with all of that. We have a problem, something I've dealt with for years and years, in deconstructing the Hollywood gypsy image, which is very, very prevalent in the United States. And it makes any attempt to present the Romani situation in a serious way not taken seriously. I teach my course. I've taught it for many years at the University of Texas. And I ask the students, where did you first hear about gypsies? Where did you first learn about gypsies? They tell me it was Disney, Hunchback of Notre Dame, Esmeralda. This is what we have to deal with. I have a lot more to say, but I think I'll keep it for the discussion that is ahead of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I listened to your historical introduction with very great interest, because to a certain extent what I'm going to speak about briefly is takes its departure from just the opposite of what you emphasized, which is not outsiderness, but being equal member of society. So the starting point is inclusionary citizenship, whether Roma enjoy inclusionary citizenship in societies where they live, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, where most of them live in Europe. And if that's not the case, and obviously all the earlier talks took it for granted that we all know that they are segregated and discriminated against, then what are the roots of that? In fact, in 10 minutes one couldn't describe that, obviously. But I would like to limit what I am going to speak about, and to address the question, which is a puzzle to a certain degree: why has the Roma issue become such a hot issue since the transition in Eastern Europe started? Did we have the same intensity of segregation, discrimination, social and ethnic and cultural inequalities before the turn in 1989, 1990? Or it was just covered, and that's just an old problem which came to the surface, and in fact we should applaud the fact that at least we know about that. It's a difficult issue, and nobody would have a straightforward answer to this question. Nevertheless, I would say that the start of what came a scandalous issue after 1989, and has been growingly scandalous in the past few years, has its roots in the state socialist era. And as you briefly described it, the Roma issue just was not on the agenda. Neither was poverty, so it was taken as a matter of cultural remoteness that has to be corrected somehow. Otherwise, Roma were mobilized as anybody else in the socialist countries to take part in compulsory full employment, compulsion in all aspects of life, which broke up in a certain way the old divisions in local societies that you described as living together, outsiders and insiders, and both parts took the other as an outsider. That rather conservative and patriarchal structure was mobilized to a large extent under socialism. One of the biggest issues was the enforcement of Roma to take up employment, and behind that to be educated at least in primary schools. And on the longer run, this enforcement turned to a very positive thing, namely that for the first time in history, Roma started to aspire to education en masse, and that proved to be a very strong, how to say, very briefly saying, I would say that an incentive for modernization of their lives. Nevertheless, when the systemic change came, it was just shutting the door in front of them. First of all, in employment, which meant, as many of you mentioned, a lead to very high degree of unemployment. You simply can't explain that just by under-education and the lack of skills. It's much deeper and relates to the internal structural problems of society and the majority society, which is in itself inadaptive in many regards to the challenges of Western market and Western democracies, and that's a long story to tell, and I can't go into details of that. But one of the major problems behind the scandalous development of the state of Roma in the former state socialist countries, which we call now members of the European Union, and they are all in Central and Eastern Europe, is that their majority society struggles with adaptation to the Western requirements, Western standards. It means that many of the people in the majority lost their jobs or are underemployed, and therefore this pressure is squeezed on the Roma, who are at the bottom and are kept at the bottom as the point of reference for internal success. So the prejudices and the heated feelings against Roma are partly, I think, in a way, a consequence of the frustration that the transition brought about for the majority society. This is very important to keep in mind, because if you want to do something for the inclusion and development of what inclusionary citizenship would mean in a Western democracy, what you should do for Roma is to take some conditions of the surrounding, of the environment into account, and you simply can't just focus on Roma themselves, because that leads to further segregation and further discrimination. Many of the attempts of the past governments went into this direction. Much was invested in Hungary into the Roma case. One cannot deny the governmental efforts that were taken. Even some cooperation between certain NGOs and the government started. Nevertheless, the dilemma was that if you just focus on the Roma, then the frustrated poor of the non-Roma, the lower middle class of the non-Roma, would become very hostile and simply kills, sometimes in physical terms, those who would be the targets of a development. So the dilemma here is very, very big, because the Roma issue has to be handled in the broader context of these fragile democracies, fragile economies, which currently struggle with the crisis to a large extent, but the problems are much deeper and much more historically rooted than just the present crisis. What we are thinking about is, and you will hear about it in one of the next panels, is to develop some integrative program with the help of the Harlem Children's Zone, which tries to address children's education in the broader context of communities. And we are just in the first phase of developing mutual knowledge about the similarities and the differences between the situation of former slaves as black people in this country were, and former slaves partly in Romania, but even those who were not slaves among the Roma lived in conditions very similar to those of slaves. And one of the lessons that I learned so far, studying a little bit what was going on here in the 1960s and 1970s prior to successful integrational programs of black children, was that somehow the whole turn of the society toward the issue had to be changed. As far as I know, prior to the Johnson era, when the war on poverty started here, the big issue was that the American public became aware that in a country where you are proud of democratic rights, you certainly cannot go ahead with such a differentiation between people that you had in those times between black and so-called white people. Such a recognition is, in my view, the basic requirement in Central and Eastern Europe, and therefore I think that we have to avoid the unintended or unintentional segregation of the Roma issue from the very broad issues of the half-sided transition that Eastern Europe has gone through in the past 2 decades. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us here discussing the issue of one of the maybe most outcast groups in societies around the globe, the Roma. The societal facts of exclusion and discrimination have translated into law years back. Empress Maria Theresia's famous decrees of 1753 and 1772 prohibited the Roma from speaking Romani, from marrying among themselves, ordered them that their children by the age of 4 had to be placed with peasants, and they were paid foster payments by the Austro-Hungarian government. The Roma were prohibited from moving from one place to another, and authorities were banned from giving them passports. They were also prohibited, the begging was prohibited, they couldn't keep horses, they had to call themselves the new Hungarians or the new peasants, like Austro-Hungary. On the other hand, the estates were obligated to establish areas of permanent settlement for the Roma and to support the Roma in practicing their artisan trades and admit them to the guilds. This could be called the Code of Ethnocide. And on the other hand, in 1944 and 1945, we had the policies under Eichmann's supervision of the Horthy government of physical extermination. God be thanked, this was stopped, and the culture survived, and we have, on the ashes of the Holocaust, the birth of a human rights regime across the globe. We had sensitivity in the post-communist era, in Hungary particularly, towards the law then remedying some of these effects of the past social and legal discrimination through the minorities law of 1993 that focused on enhancing, protecting cultural identity through individual and collective rights. Internationally, the protections were based on the general human rights regime. The most effective of those protections were the ones implemented by the European Court of Human Rights. And it has established a couple of landmark interpretations that might more or less respond to the problems, to the plight, to the predicament that Romani face in various countries throughout the jurisdiction of the court. The cases addressed instances of police abuse, expulsion, home and privacy violations, discrimination in housing, libel, defamation, community violence, and, are we surprised, freedom of movement. Police abuse cases, I'll just refer to Belikova versus Bulgaria, 18th May of 2000. Mr. Chonchev, a man of Romani origin, was arrested and detained on charges of cattle theft. After 12 hours in police custody, he died from injuries sustained as a result of brutal beating. Prosecutor dropped the investigation because it was supposedly impossible to determine where he was beaten and by whom. The European Court came to the conclusion that there had been a violation of Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights, right to life, and Article 13's right to an effective remedy, because there was a burden on the Bulgarian authorities to refute the applicant's charges, especially where an individual is taken into police custody in good health but is later found dead. It is incumbent upon the state to provide a plausible explanation of the events leading to his death. Now, there's another provision that was invoked by the applicant, Article 14, the provision of discrimination. The claim of racial prejudice, however, was seen as not constituting a violation because the standard of proof was raised to beyond a reasonable doubt. So in the civil proceeding, the criminal law standard of proof was applied. A similar case, Angelova versus Bulgaria in 2002, the same result was reached by a dissenting opinion by Judge Bonello said we need to have a lower standard of proof for discrimination, in case of racial discrimination, because it then becomes illusory and inoperative, this prohibition, if that standard of proof is higher than in other civil law disputes. In Balog v. Hungary in 2004, a Roma was interrogated by police charges that he had allegedly stolen fuel vouchers. And the allegation was that officers had slapped him across the face and ear and punched him on the shoulder. His eardrum was seriously damaged and his working capacity reduced. The criminal proceedings were discontinued because it was, quote, impossible to determine when the injuries had been inflicted. The European Court stated that Article 3, the freedom from inhumane treatment, was implicated and violated. It was sufficiently serious an injury. The authorities failed to provide an explanation after he had been in police custody and had been arriving there in good health, but was found to be injured at the time of release. Should give a plausible explanation for this. In a later case, last case now for police treatment, Nachova versus Bulgaria and Bekos versus Greece, they maintained this high standard of proof of beyond a reasonable doubt, but they said the state has to investigate whether or not discrimination had played a role in these events. Here there was a failure to investigate what led to the police ill treatment of the Roma. A second case, and I'm skipping over expulsion case now, I'm going to home and privacy rights. In Buckley versus United Kingdom in 1996, a British citizen of Roma origin had lived in a caravan parked on land owned by her in England. A permit was refused because there were supposedly alternative caravan placements elsewhere in the area, and the planned use detracted from the rural quality of the land. The court then stated there's no violation of Article 8. In 2000, Article 8, which is the right to home and privacy, because the government pursued a legitimate aim and there was a proportionate response because there was an alternative place offered. In Chapman versus UK in 2001, it's a range of cases, a similar permit was refused, and the court went in a bit more detail into a discussion. It was a 10-7 opinion. The Western European judges were 6 of the 7 dissenters. Majority was basically coming from Eastern European part. The court said, we can now see a development towards a positive state obligation to facilitate what they call a gypsy way of life, which is including traveling. But there are limitations possible that are necessary in a democratic society. And this particular special accommodation is not crystallized yet in particular standards of conduct that we require of states. It's not sufficiently concrete, and there's a margin of appreciation where they can deny this permitting of caravans in this case, of living arrangements of Roma, and based on environmental or zoning considerations that they consider relevant. The dissenters said, we have here a situation, there was no alternative accommodation for the Roma. They couldn't find other places, and there should have been seen as a violation of their right to home and privacy. And the last case in this was Connors versus UK in 2004, an eviction from a traditional Roma campsite. They also, the European Court of Human Rights found a violation of Article 8. The vulnerable position of gypsies as a minority had to lead to a special consideration of their needs and their different lifestyles in a regulatory framework and in the decision-making in particular cases. Here there were no sufficient procedural safeguards against their eviction that were either prescribed or observed. Last case wanted to mention here was Oršuš versus Croatia. Just came down on March 16, 2010. 9-8, very close decision. This decision was addressing the issue of education of Roma kids in separate classes, only Roma classes, which produced, similar to Brown with its education here, emotional, psychological harm. We call it here stigmatic injury. They had an inferior curriculum. And the court found that this case was lingering over 4 years in the Hungarian Constitutional Court, that this was excessively lengthy in terms of the civil proceeding, Article 6.1, but more importantly it said there was the anti-discrimination provision of Article 14 violated in connection with the right of education. So this is where we stand. There was no objective and reasonable justification. So we go back to the issue of segregation, and I would leave it at this point with this overview of what the legal enshrining, if you want, of societal prejudice was, and how we should address this. We'll have some ideas maybe in the discussion.
Thank you very much. Each speaker has presented, as it were, a different perspective on the first assignment of this panel, which is, as you'll notice from the program, taking stock. Professor Hancock has shown us the historical roots and the transformation of, am I audible this way? Yes. The transformation of the Romani peoples as they migrated westward, and has demonstrated that although one talks about a people, it is in fact a very heterogeneous universe, and it is motivated, different groups within it are motivated by entirely different goals, some of them incompatible. And he's also pointed out the fact that some of the problem or resistance to Romani integration comes from the Romani people themselves practicing what any minority group member will appreciate, this sort of defensive, a type of defensive discrimination against the larger group. So we have a population that does not have a single goal. As opposed to this, Professor Zalai has shown us that the latent problems, which were somewhat dormant during the socialist period because of the mobilization of a command economy, have now reemerged in exacerbated form as these countries go through, or these societies go through, a very slow and painful transition to a capitalist and free market society. A transition which has been very difficult for the general population, and Professor Zalai says maybe one of the factors that has exacerbated the majority group discrimination against Romani peoples. Professor Wiesner has given us a very thorough review of the response of the institutions of the European community, in particular the European Court of Human Rights, which has had a number of cases on its docket dealing with discriminations against Romani people. What emerges from his review is that there is a good deal of uncertainty and not unanimity or consensus on that bench with what is the appropriate method for dealing with a problem, or indeed what the problem is. The second assignment for this panel, to which I'd like to turn everyone's attention now, is on the program, looking ahead. What should be done? Let me throw out one question for everyone. What is the more general society entitled to do with respect to what Professor Sklar at Harvard called permanent minorities, but might be better referred to here as durable or enduring minorities? To what extent is it entitled to restructure the psycho-personal organization of peoples who want to maintain their own cultures? To what extent is it entitled actively to integrate? To what extent is there a one-size-fits-all solution, which seems to be the assumption in some of the government programs? Perhaps we can address this problem following the order of presentation and start with you, Professor Hancock.
Thank you. Well, I'm an educator, and I believe that education is fundamental to any changes that we want to come about. Education not only within the Romani world, but outside of it as well. One problem is that we as, let me say, a people, as many peoples, but one people, don't know our history. We don't know where we really come from, and we need to know that if we want to understand where we're going and why we are the way we are. But at the same time, as I said when I spoke earlier, the non-Romani world has a very poor understanding of who we are. I'm sitting here looking at a Charlie Chaplin poster over there. I wonder how many of you know that Charlie Chaplin's mother was Romani. That's not generally known. The contributions that Roma have made, especially in Hungary, especially in the musical tradition from Hungary in the Austro-Hungarian period, is immense. That should be recognized. It should be recognized, and I say this when I'm only speaking to all Romani audiences. We should be proud of our endurance. If you look at the history, and this surprises my students, they come into the class expecting something light and airy and gypsies and dancing and singing, and then learn about quite horrible oppression sometimes, Holocaust, slavery, genocide, and it takes them aback. But I use this to emphasize the fact that without a country, without a militia, without an economy, we're still here, and this is a testament to survival. And we can harness that. If we knew more about our history, if there were, just as there are in this country, academic recognition of multicultural societies. My kids go to school and they learn about the contributions of Mexican Americans, African Americans, and so on, as they should. There are very few such courses in Europe that teach the children, the students, about Romani history. And I think perhaps if people understood better what we've had to deal with in order to survive and maintain our identity, there would be a better, what can I say, I don't want to say sympathy, I don't like the victim aspect, but there would be a better understanding and maybe a better tolerance. And I don't like that word either, but it's a beginning. So education for me is very important, and there should be a better understanding of multicultural societies, bilingual education programs. Those children in those schools for the mentally retarded are there because they may not speak Slovak very well, or Czech very well, or Romanian very well. It doesn't mean they're stupid. They speak Romani. So this is where we have to look. Education for me is prime.
I think I would very much go along with what you said. So education is certainly is of primary importance, and a number of dilemmas can be resolved or should be resolved, or at least addressed with regard to education. Whether that's minority awareness that has to be raised first, which would imply certain separation of Roma children in certain cases, or it's just integration and somehow it should be general education that would or should have to be restructured around multicultural notion of not only Romani people but other ethnic groups and minority groups in Central and Eastern Europe. In addition to what you said, I would think that a new approach has to be taken a little bit, which is a human rights and democratic rights approach. So I very deeply believe that without questioning the differentiation in access to certain democratic rights in the new democracies of Central and Eastern Europe, without emphasizing that people's recognition and groups' recognition is a precondition of their participation in the democracy, we do not get too far. So democratic thinking has to be strengthened all over the region, and as part of it, minority rights have to be raised and human rights issues have to be raised. I would be a little bit skeptical just to go into a more efficient direction. Superficially, it looks very efficient to raise simple issues of economic development and so on, and invest into the economic side of catching up with qualifications and put only into the economically useful aspects of integration. I would take it in a very much extended contextualization and would emphasize that democratic rights, that's the corner, or that's the point of departure that I would go for the issues of Roma.
Thank you. Well, as you might have seen from my brief overview of the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights, the general human rights regime that they're enforcing may not be sufficient. May not be sufficient to respond to the needs and aspirations of the various individuals that have congregated in their group. It's one of their main strivings to live together and preserve their identity. Law should be serving human beings, not the other way around. So we need to think about how to reshape the law, how to give direction. And I think the best starting point is to listen to people and their aspirations, is to listen to their claims. And we think that these collective claims, the group claims to preserving the identity, are the ones that are in the modern human rights documents, the International Covenants on the Political Rights, and also the European Convention, very much neglected. There are individual members' rights of groups to preserve their culture, but there is not a collective right of the group to preserve it. I must say that in the Hungarian context, the minorities law of 1993 goes pretty far in terms of protecting those collective rights as well, and some national and local self-government schemes were implemented to respond to the claim for autonomy. I think to shape these rights, we need to listen again, and I'm here to do that. I've worked a bit in the field of indigenous people's rights on the international level. They're also vulnerable groups. They also have a claim to land, and that has been recognized in the Universal Declaration, in the United Nations Declaration of 2007 on the rights of indigenous peoples. Claim to land from a cultural perspective. They couldn't live outside the land. Now, in the case of the Roma, we might have just the opposite. We want to live outside the land. But we also don't have the protection of what we can get through territorial autonomy, which is you can regulate your local and internal affairs on a certain piece of the planet. So this is where I'm coming here to learn from Ian and others who what the real aspirations are, what the culture are, and maybe we do best when we reconstruct this legal regime, that we start from that.
I will resist the temptation to throw out some more questions to our speakers and open the floor, but reserve the right to intervene if something is particularly delectable. We don't have a great deal of time. Yes, please.
Could I ask
the microphones.
one just point, and it relates to how involved we become. Do you have any idea of how many Romani there are in the United States?
In North?
There are about 1.2 million in North America, and a larger number in South America, which surprises a lot of people.
How many?
About 1.2 million.
No, but in South.
It's hard to say, possibly between 2 and 3 million. Yes, the very high figures. One interesting aspect of this, we had the recent census forms sent out and returned. A lot of Romani Americans, if they answer them, the forms at all, which very few do, put Romanian instead of Romani, and may call themselves Romanian, which of course puts up the Romanian demographic and lowers the Romani one. Yeah.
Is that intentional or?
No, it's not. It's just a common variant of Romani, I guess.
I wonder whether the affirmative action has been practiced in any of the Central or Eastern European countries, and if there has, whether there has been any results. Or if that could be one of the alternatives, one of the ways of trying to force businesses, universities, government to just incorporate the minorities into the system.
Yes and no, I would say, that would be the response. So there have been some initiatives, especially in Hungary, quite efficient ones, to develop special programs, for example, for employment, to give some extra funding to enterprises for employing Roma, and also in schools, so for secondary education and in higher education, there have been certain steps taken toward raising the proportion of Roma and having access, who have access to secondary and higher education. Strangely enough, or not so strangely enough, these initiatives turned out to be very double-edged. On the one hand, they helped for a short while to get more employment for Roma, or better education, or better access to education. On the other hand, the outcome has been an intense segregation and tendency of separation of those kids or those employees who enjoyed this program, and the heated hatred that has been rising around these initiatives on the side of the public seems to be very frightening. So there is not a real acceptance of these programs. And the third quite strange thing is that as statistics show and some surveys show, non-Roma just cheat and get into these programs because they think that that's unjust, that just Roma have some affirmative action for entrance at secondary, better entrance at secondary schools or in employment. So non-Roma just register themselves as Roma and take over some of these programs.
Can I add something very quickly to that? I've testified in asylum cases in this country where Eastern Europeans have tried to present themselves as Roma when they're not, in order to be allowed refuge in this country.
My understanding, I may be wrong, is that basically they like to keep moving around. So it's sort of difficult to establish schools and jobs if they don't really want to stay in one place for a very long time. Is that true, or am I hearing something I shouldn't be?
That's more storybook gypsies than real-life Roma. For example, slavery in Romania lasted for more than 5 centuries and they didn't go anywhere. A very tiny minority of Roma actually are itinerant. For those that are, mostly in Western Europe, more than Eastern Europe, there are mobile classrooms that go from place to place to accommodate them. But the idea of the happy wandering gypsy is fiction.
There's a statistic, 2003, a survey. Out of a population of 570,000 Roma in Hungary, 6% lived in isolated, segregated Roma settlements alone, 2% away from villages, 42% on the outskirts of villages, 22% within villages, but inhabited mostly in areas mostly occupied by Roma themselves. So we have about 72% of the Roma living in a segregated way, but living rather, as Ian said, sedentary way. As far as this minority protection and affirmative action goes, I just want to refer to Article 70 of the Hungarian Constitution and Article 68, which mandates some affirmative measures aimed at eliminating inequalities of opportunity. Minorities Act of '93 tries to do some of this, but the question is the definition of minorities at times. It's defined in a way that they have to be resident at a certain place for 100 years. And that is difficult to prove.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. I recognize the gentleman who showed his hand up for a while.
Thank you. I'm actually a self-appointed representative of Ireland, and I actually lived with itinerants, travellers, tinkers in 1965, until about 1971. And I'm curious as to why they haven't been included in the Roma, broadly speaking. They're somehow even a more isolated group. And I could go on a long time, but that's the first question I'd like to put to the panel.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's actually a good question because it leads into something that you brought up already, and I think is fundamental to this. Are we looking at abuses of human rights or of Roma rights? There are two ways, equally valid. If we're dealing with Roma, then we have a special case divided into many, many small special cases. If we're dealing with human rights, we're dealing with the whole planet. Irish travelers are not Romani people. They are indigenous European people. And from a Romani point of view, they are Gage. They are not us. Should that disqualify them? Of course not. But there is this blurring of categorization. We have the Romani, next month in June in Britain will be Romani and Traveller History Month. Romani and Traveller, which includes non-Romani, itinerant and marginal. Yes, so from the outside, yes, they're all gypsies. The media call us all gypsies. They call Irish travellers gypsies. They will quickly tell you we are not Romani people. There was a whole thing on NPR not long ago about that. And here we have a large, they call themselves Minkers. They will strenuously tell you we are not Romani people. We are Irish travellers. They do endure some of the same hardships socially that Romani people do, and should get no lesser billing because they're not Romani. They also have cultural characteristics of their own. They have their own ethnolectal speech. But if we are looking for a policy of how to address the situation for each group, it's going to be different at the ground level, because certain things will be allowed and certain things won't be allowed. at the cultural level. And so one blanket policy is not going to work. At the ethnic level, at the social level, most of it will work. But there is a difference. Romani people and Irish travelers are different people.
I disagree.
I am afraid that we have, as the Soviets used to say, exceeded our plan. We've gone beyond the time allotted to us. I'm certain that many of the issues that were raised in such acute form by the discussion now will be raised in the other panels, and those of you who've reserved questions can, I'm sure, present them then. And so, at this moment, I'll declare this particular panel closed and yield to Ambassador Polgar.